Good morning. Yesterday, during the live streaming of my mother's celebration of life service, the live stream cut off before the actual eulogy, and I know a lot of her friends wanted to see it, so here it is. Beverly Ruth Ballard was born at home on March 19th, 1939 at 1 p.m. Her parents were married 3 years earlier. Her father was a 24-year-old mail carrier and her mother a 23-year-old housewife. Look pretty good, don't they? Bread was 10 cents a loaf. Eggs were 32 cents a dozen. The average income was $1,400 a year. The cost of a new car was $750. Gas was 19 cents a gallon. And you could purchase a new house for $4,000. She saw a lot of change in her life. The year she was born marks the end of the Depression. But Hitler had invaded Poland, and the world was on the brink of a war that would last until the fall of 1945, when Beverly was 6 years old. It was a time of unity as America celebrated the end of World War II. Mom always said she thought she was born at the perfect time in history, that her upbringing was idyllic. She was the center of the universe at home. Even after she was full grown and had a grown child of her own, when her friends back in Sulphur Springs would run into her dad, he would say, "Well, have you seen that baby lately?" That baby was like 40 years old. She was proud of being an only child, who gave birth to an only child, who gave birth to an only child, Jimmy, who gave us 5 beautiful grandchildren, Jordan, Kelsey, Kennedy, Caden, and Cole. She loved them all dearly. I think because she was an only child, she grew up very close to her 4 cousins, Wanda, Patsy, Bobby, and Jane. And they all spent the summer at her grandparents', sleeping on pallets, playing in the garden and among the fruit trees and flowers, listening to her granddad play the harmonica along with the gospel music on the radio, riding in the back of the dump truck down to the sand pits where they could play, while her grandmother was back at the house cooking in the kitchen. She has had a set of friends that she started out with in grade school, some even before that. Friendships like I can only imagine. Many of these women have been a force in my life for as long as I can remember. But before they were women, they were teenage girls. Okay, they're having it up here because my mother would never hitchhike. There's her best friend, Nita Lou. This looks like a shot right out of Grease. And here, I think she's probably 15, 16 years old. In the summer of '54, my mom was 15, and she and Nita had decided to drive into town. They were going to take the tractor, which Nita had been driving since she's like 5 years old, I promise. So Nita pulls out into the road in front of Bobby Putman, a 16-year-old hooligan who has a reputation for being a bit of a scoundrel. I don't know, I think he was pretty handsome. So when Nita pulls out in front of him, Bobby jumps out of the car and he is ready to give her a good cussing. And that's something he knows a little bit about. But according to Nita, he sees my mom and everything changes. And I mean everything. In that moment, my existence is put into motion. July 1954 is the first mention of my dad in her diary. I have to assume that's a few days after their encounter on the highway. He calls and asks for a date. Now, that night she had a date with Chuck, who was her current beau. And according to Nita, Chuck was a real nice guy, but dull as dirt. So on their date that night, she writes in her diary that she and Chuck decided to call it quits. But he gives her his class ring to keep for him. Doesn't sound like it was a mutual breakup to me. The next day, she goes on a date with my dad. 2 weeks later, my dad tells her he loves her. I can see my mom now. You don't even know me. So she continues to see Chuck and to correspond with this guy named Jim from Dallas. But that doesn't deter my dad. 2 weeks later, He asked her to go steady. I can see her rolling her eyes now. It's summer and school's out. She's headed to spend a couple of weeks in Dallas with her cousins where she's going to see Jim. The day after she gets home, Bobby asked her to go steady for the second time. But it turns out that her parents don't approve of Bobby Putman's reputation, and probably for good reason. He and his two brothers are known for getting into fights. I remember my dad telling stories of his dad coming home and telling him, "Come on, Bobby, get in the car. We're going to go into town and give old so-and-so a good cussing." And he wanted Daddy there for muscle. She continues to date Bobby and to correspond with Jim, and at the end of the summer, Jim decides to come to Sulphur Springs for a visit. She writes in her diary it's the first time she's real mad at Bob. But she doesn't say why. I happen to know from family history that when Jim comes to town, Daddy asks him if he's ever been down to the reservoir where a lot of the local kids like to hang out. Why, no, he's never been. So Dad took him down there to the reservoir and proceeded to kick his ass. She might have been real mad, but she later writes that around this time is when she finds herself falling in love with Daddy. But this girl has not made up her mind. Jim goes back to Dallas, and she goes out on a date the next day with Chuck. You remember Chuck? She's keeping his ring for him. The next day, Jim calls and tells her he loves her. Stay with me. Keep in mind that she doesn't completely end it with Jim until a year later. While they'll see each other off and on, along with other people, my mom and dad will not start going steady until 6 months later. And even then, they will break up and get back together a couple of times over the next year. Now, September 3rd of 1955, Elvis was not yet king, but he was a rising star. And when he appeared on the program at the Big D Jamboree, it was just too tempting for our teenage terrorists. She and Nita, along with a friend named Billy Catherine, drive to Dallas where they meet up with her cousins and go to see Elvis in person. Nita wants to stay and get his autograph. But Beverly is afraid they might be found out by their parents back home, that they've been in Dallas. So she wants to go straight home. Believe it or not from these stories, but my mom was a straight arrow. Things for her were pretty black or white. It was right or it was wrong. Hence why she was conflicted. I take great comfort from an entry in my mom's diary a few months after the trip to see Elvis. January 29th, 1956. Sunday school and church with Margaret Ann. Bob called and came over at 1:30. Rode all afternoon. Date after work. Bob became Christian tonight. It turned out for the best. My parents got married February 28th of 1956 before a justice of the peace. They made a pretty good looking couple, didn't they? There they are with Nita Lou at the wedding shower. At the tender age of 17 and 18, they moved to Tyler, Texas, where Dad got a job working for the bread company. I was born in October of that year. My friends and I always joked that I was raised by June and Ward Cleaver. Despite their on-again, off-again courtship, once they committed to each other, I don't believe they ever looked back. I never heard my parents fight. I know they did, but they never did it where I could hear. They did everything they could to give me a perfect home life. She titled this photo, Best Friends. And she was right. She found my dad, and despite her better judgment, she fell in love with him. She never let go. For that alone, I could never thank her enough. She instilled a love of Christmas in me at an early age. This is where my craziness began. After I had a house of my own, she and I would get up the day after Christmas at 6 a.m. and we would travel all over Dallas buying up every unique Christmas thing that we could find for 50 to 75% off. I remember poker parties late into the night with Nita and Gerald. Lots of laughing and carrying on. My parents were the only one of their friends who had a child at that time. And I remember being awakened in the night at the end of the poker party so that we could go have breakfast, where I would sleep in the booth next to them. I had several dogs, even though my parents weren't really dog people. They made sure I knew how to skate, swim, and ride a bike. Much to the dismay of all the adults in our neighborhood, my dad made stilts, slingshots, bows and arrows for every kid on the block. They put me in Girl Scouts and made sure I was on the pep squad. Ferris Watson Wildcats, rah, rah, rah. My parents added Joe and Jean Northcutt and Fran and Fred Houseman to their list of friends. And I just remember so much laughter when they were all together. She was a seamstress extraordinaire. She always talked about how nice I looked. See, she made me the little dress there. I was so put together. She talked about how nice I looked when I went out the door with my little dresses and matching bags. But when I came home, the dress was stained. I still can't wear white. The sash was torn, and I don't know where I left that little purse. She made most of my clothes, even in junior high, and I wasn't embarrassed. She was that good. But she also understood the need to be cool factor. And when they went to Mexico, she sought out and brought back the coolest leather French jacket that she could find. But it was the 70s, and I tried their patience. I remember when Dad caught me and my girlfriend smoking at the bowling alley, and we told him that we found them, and we were just curious, and it was our first time. And it was working until we got home, and he told Mom. And she was like, Bobby, they are lying to you. She was kind of a buzzkill that way. And at that time, I considered her the enemy. But in 1972, when I was 15 and Randy was 16 and Jimmy was on his way, even though it wasn't what they had planned for my life, they did everything they could to help us. They knew how hard it was going to be. She used to joke that before I became pregnant, I wouldn't give her the time of day. But after I got married, she couldn't go to the grocery store without me wanting to tag along. And that's true. But whether she approved of my decisions or not, she always had my back. We weren't best friends. I don't need another friend. She was always my mother, and I was always her daughter. I remember Mom and Dad and Nita and Gerald and Molly and James taking trips to Vegas. Check out that hair. It was crazy. Mm-hmm. But they were all pretty good looking, right? I mean, I think they made handsome couples. I went with the girls once to Vegas when the boys were deer hunting. And we sat at the blackjack table for hours. When they entered the Golden Nugget, the pit boss would yell out, "Hey, Dallas!" These girls were having that much fun. They were that memorable. My mom was a great poker player, but she was also naturally lucky. I would sit next to her at the blackjack table and get her advice on every hand I got dealt. But she would hit 4 blackjacks for every one that I would get. She taught Jimmy and all the grandkids how to play poker. Both my parents were awesome cooks. My dad sold steaks to some of the best steakhouses in Texas. They threw New Year's Eve parties that were legendary and got larger every year, until one year they looked around and realized they didn't know a lot of the people there. I think that was the year that after throwing this rip-snorting New Year's Eve party, they get up the next morning and they stood with Jan and Bob Harris as best man and matron. To say that they were little hungover is probably an understatement. They weren't exactly firing on all cylinders when the Justice of the Peace turns to Jan and says, "Do you take Bob to be your lawfully wedded husband to have and to hold from this day forward?" Jan says yes. He turns to Bob and he says, "Bob, do you take Beverly to be your lawfully wedded wife?" And my mom is standing there and she is freaking out because for a minute she forgets that Jan's first name is Beverly. And she's thinking she's fixing to be married to Bob Harris. They always had a lot of fun. Mom's mother had been a teller at the bank in Silver Springs, and when Mom entered the workforce, my dad got her a job in Garland at American National Bank. She only had a GED, and yet she rose through the ranks and was the vice president over operations when she retired. Like I said, my mom was a straight arrow, and she had high expectations of anyone who worked for her. I believe she was well liked, but I remember one of the ladies who worked for her saying, "I always hated it when she talked to me in that school teacher voice." Yeah, me too. She made lifelong friends there. Her bosses, who she adored, Don Holland and Roy Lambert, and her cohorts in shenanigans, Kay, Debbie, Brenda, Sharon. She and her girlfriends from American National Bank had dinners together, shopped together. You remember how I said she was a lucky gambler? She won the football pot at the bank so many times there was talk of foul play. But then they were like, "No, it's Beverly. She's such a straight arrow." There were trips to the Rangers games, horse races, and since Jimmy was basically the bank mascot, he usually tagged along. She was an amazing grandmother. She and Daddy taught me how it's done. She and Jimmy would go shopping for school clothes every year. I only tagged along one time and then they kicked me out. My parents took Troy and Jimmy wherever they wanted to go. Six Flags, Hurricane Harbor, Devil's Bowl, wrestling matches, countless sleepovers. My mother was style and grace personified. I tried to get her to be an interior decorator, like her friend Mary. But she didn't want to because someone would want her to do something modern, and she didn't want to do that. She was an avid reader, and there was often an album playing on the stereo, Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, Red Roses for a Blue Lady, Chet Atkins, Chris Christopherson. And she always knew what was going to be hot before it ever hit the stores. Early American, animal prints, elephants, monkeys, even llamas. She had an eye for accessories and knickknacks, and she liked the very best. Our home always looked like photos out of house and garden. And don't get me started on gardening. She had a green thumb and she could grow anything. Her backyard was an oasis. I like to ask people what they remember their parents repeating to them again and again. You know, like back in the day, all the mothers would tell the girls, "Be sure that you have on clean underwear that's not torn in case you get in an accident and the firefighters have to cut your clothes off." Good advice. What I remember my mom saying was, "Kill them with kindness. If someone is mean to you, be especially kind to them." It's the biblical equivalent of overcome evil with good. It was great advice, and it has served me well all my life. One of my mom's favorite sayings was, "The two greatest gifts you can give a child are roots and wings." She certainly gave me both those things. She knew when to hold on and when to let go. The last few years were hard on Mom. There was a lot of loss in her life. I think she felt adrift at sea. The rudder to her ship was missing. She couldn't quite find her bearings. It can happen to all of us. Life is hard. Before Jesus goes to the cross, he's trying to prepare the disciples for what's about to happen. He says to them, "In this world you will have trouble, but fear not, for I have overcome the world. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go and prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also." And doubting Thomas spoke for us all. And he said, "Lord, we don't know where you're going, and we don't know the way." And Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me." Yet the disciples did not understand that he was talking about his impending death. And a few days after Jesus has been crucified, we find the disciples cowering. They're afraid that Roman soldiers are going to break in and drag them away, and that they will be stripped, beaten, and crucified. They are terrified. But after Jesus appears to them in his glorified body, after they see what awaits after death, everything changed. You couldn't shut them up. They wanted everyone to be saved. They were beaten, imprisoned, killed, because they would not stop proclaiming the story of Jesus. I believe that Mom has traded her tired, broken, corruptible body for one that is incorruptible. She has traded this mortal shell for immortality. I believe when she closed her eyes to the pain of this world, she found herself reunited with Bobby Putman, face to face with Jimmy's son, and is walking hand in hand with my granddaughter Kelsey. I can only imagine the great cloud of people that surround her, all the lives she's touched. As she was surrounded here, she is surrounded there. I thank you guys for listening. I will post the slideshow from her service soon. Thank you.